All right, well, this is a little preliminary piece. I'm going to read a draft of Volume 2, Aphorism 1, but this is just a discussion of what the issues are. Basically, this first section talks about the meaning of the word primacy and primary and fundamental, and describes a struggle of sorts between three concepts that metaphorically all vie for primacy. Which one gets to be primary? They all have claims to being primary, each of these three ideas. So the ideas are will, perception, and so it's will versus perception, and then natural philosophy. Okay, so firstly, natural philosophy. Okay, natural philosophy, we all have a natural philosophy. You know, it's a philosophy about what nature is like. What is nature? Now, I think it's interesting to note that both historically and personally, we start out with natural philosophies which include all perceptions. They don't just include sense perceptions. We make no distinction. So going back in time, you know, when we saw faces in the clouds or in the bark of a tree, we accepted all of those as input to our natural philosophy. There were really gods in there. There were really spirits in there. We accepted all of that. When we dreamt at night, we might know it wasn't the real world because we could wake up and see it was different, but we'd think that we had gone to the spirit world. We gave a tangible reality to all of our perceptions. This might not be literally true. You know, ask the anthropologists and historians of mind, you know, what is specifically gone, what path, you know, humans have taken. But you can see that to a decent approximation philosophically, yes, we start out bringing all of our perceptions into our natural philosophy of what is natural, you know, which is related to what is real. Okay, and it's not just like ancient people. We as individuals have gone through this process, right? As kids, we tend to accept all of our perceptions as informative about what the world is, about what is natural, our so-called natural philosophy. Our philosophy about nature, about what is real. Okay. So the argument that natural philosophy is primary just comes from the fact that it really is the first thing we form. We form a natural philosophy out of which we even get the idea of you know, the ideas of perception and stuff. So in a way, the natural philosophy, this is a natural process. In other words, our very minds have evolved around the need to conceive of nature. So it's possible to describe that as primary. But that required me to think about, well, what is relativistic skepticism really? It's not my whole philosophy. It's not every philosophy. It's not every aspect of philosophy. It has no political philosophy to it. There's you know, there's a lot missing if you compare it to my whole philosophy. So what is it? Well, it's a theory of epistemology. It's about knowledge being relativistic and skeptical. That's what it's about. So it's an epistemological approach. So we're really going to ask, in terms of primary, is, you know, if we forget everything we think we know and start over, what reasserts itself? You know, what reasserts itself as real? What is the first knowledge, and then what subsequent knowledge is based on that and sort of requires that? And that's what we mean by most fundamental, and that's what we mean by primary as the starting point. Okay, and the term exist. See, it could be put in terms of will, or it could be put in terms of perception. Now, Descartes, after going to this point, because basically I'm saying I want to start from a Cartesian skepticism, and where you forget, that's where you forget everything and start asking, well, what do I know anyway? And he said, I think, therefore I am. Basically, implicitly, It's a bit of a jumble to know exactly what he did. That's a complex statement, but it seems simple, but it's there's complexity to it still. But see, he says, I think, I'm willing, therefore I am. So, he's the cause of a thought, that he's the cause of that's his primary thing. And he's basing his existence on willing. And a lot of philosophers like to do this. It really seems that in some sense, even if I had no senses, no perceptions, I could still be there willing and wanting. But for me, I'm sort of a naturalist in this kind of thing. If you get no information, if you have a will and it gets no information, then it doesn't actually come to any willful moments, so can it really be said to be a will? And I tend towards no, because we're not talking about what if a human being had all its senses severed. We're talking about conceptually. We don't even know if the body is real. If we had absolutely no input and also no brain to receive it, I don't see how there'd be a will. Basically, I think that the will is something that's energized by the sensations. The will only occurs when there's input to process and then react with. But I don't really know. I think it's a fair point. But again, in deciding that I would base my definition of existence on perceptions and then making will secondary, that's going to be section 2 in volume 1, the will. It's pretty primary, but not as much as perception. The reason was, again, epistemologically, what do we know first? Well, what I know about the will is because I perceive myself as trying to act. I perceive the perceptions in the real world that seem to correspond to my action, and then I perceive the results. And so perceptions are primary. I have to know about perceptions to know about will. So for me, perceptions win this struggle.
Another thing I think worth pointing out here is that what's primary in Volume 1 is different from what's primary in Volume 2. Overall, in my complete philosophy, looking at it as a poet philosopher, what's primary in Volume 2 is actually natural philosophy. Okay, it is the natural philosophy. But epistemologically, no. How do I define existence? In terms of perceptions. But in terms of where do I get that, it's these criteria, they all tend to flow from the fact that I'm a natural philosopher, that I believe all of our knowledge comes from nature ultimately. That's my big picture. And the point being, we have all of our perceptions, including the illusions, feeding into this natural philosophy. And the job of sorting out the illusions is not yet over. We're just slowly working on this. And also, when we find that some perception was not directly from reality, like we see a shape in the clouds that we know is our imagination, how do we take that into account? We're slowly identifying which perceptions are sensual, which perceptions we can rely on. When we decide one is less real, we can't really get rid of it, we can just take it into account. So I still see faces in the cloud, but I know that it's part of my imagination, that I don't consider that part of the sense perceptions directly.